Of Mice and Men, Chapter 4. Crooks, the stable buck, had his bunk in the harness room, a little shed that leaned off of the wall of the barn. On one side of the little room there was a square four-paned window, and on the other a narrow plank door leading into the barn. Crooks's bunk was a long box filled with straw, on which his blankets were flung. On the wall by the window there were pegs on which hung broken harnesses in process of being mended, strips of new leather, and under the window itself a little bench for leather working tools, curved knives, needles, and balls of linen thread, and a small hand riveter. On pegs were also pieces of harness, a split collar over his bunk, and in it a range of medicine bottles, both for himself and for the horses. There were cans of saddle soap and a drippy can of tar with its paintbrush sticking over the edge. And scattered about the floor were a number of personal possessions, for, being alone, Crooks could leave his things about, and being a stable buck and a cripple, he was more permanent than the other men, and he had accumulated more possessions than he could carry on his back. Crooks possessed several pairs of shoes, a pair of rubber boots, a big alarm clock, and a single-barreled shotgun. And he had books, too, a tattered dictionary and a mauled copy of the California Civil Code for 1905. There were battered magazines and a few dirty books on a special shelf over his bunk. A pair of large gold-rimmed spectacles hung from a nail on the wall above his bed. This room was swept and fairly neat, for Crooks was a proud, aloof man. He kept his distance and demanded that other people keep theirs. His body was bent over to the left by his crooked spine, and his eyes lay deep in his head, and because of their depth seemed to glitter with intensity. His lean face was lined with deep black wrinkles, and he had thin, pain-tightened lips which were lighter than his face. It was Saturday night. Through the open door that led into the barn came the sound of moving horses, of feet stirring, of teeth chomping on hay, of the rattle of halter chains. In the stable buck's room, a small electric globe threw a meager yellow light. Crooks sat on his bunk. His shirt was out of his jeans and back. In one hand he held a bottle of liniment, and with the other he rubbed his spine. Now and then he poured a few drops of the liniment into his pink-palmed hand and reached up under his shirt to rub it again. He flexed his muscles against his back and shivered. What do you think is different about Crooks compared to the other men? Noiselessly, Lenny appeared in the open doorway and stood there looking in, his big shoulders nearly filling the opening. For a moment Crooks did not see him, but on raising his eyes he stiffened and a scowl came on his face. His hand came out from under his shirt. Lenny smiled helplessly in an attempt to make friends. Crooks said sharply, "You got no right to come in my room. This here's my room. Nobody got any right in here but me." Lenny gulped, and his smile grew more fawning. "I ain't doing nothing," he said. "Just come to look at my puppy. And I seen your light," he explained. "Well, I got a right to have a light. You go on and get out of my room. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse, and you ain't wanted in my room." "Why ain't you wanted?" Lenny asked. What does this question tell us about Lenny's understanding of people and race? "'Cause I'm black. They play cards in there, and I can't play because I'm black. They say I stink. Well, I tell you, all of you stink to me." Lenny flapped his big hands helplessly. "Everybody went into town," he said. "Slim and George and everybody. George says I gotta stay here and not get in no trouble. I seen your light." "Well, what'd he want?" "Nothin'. I seen your light. I thought I could just come in and set." Crooks stared at Lenny, and he reached behind him and took down the spectacles and adjusted them over his pink ears and stared again. "I don't know what you're doing in the barn anyway," he complained. "You ain't no Skinner. They's no call for a bucker to come into the barn at all. You ain't no Skinner. You ain't got nothing to do with the horses." "The pup," Lenny repeated. "I come to see my pup." "Well, go see your pup then. Don't come in a place where you're not wanted." Lenny lost his smile. He advanced a step into the room, then remembered and backed to the door again. I looked at him a little. Sim says I ain't to pet him very much. Crook said, Well, you been taking him out of the nest all the time. I wonder the old lady don't move him someplace else. Oh, she don't care. She lets me. Lenny had moved into the room again. Crook scowled, but Lenny's disarming smile defeated him. Come in and set a while, Crook said. Long as you won't go get out and leave me alone, you might as well sit down. His tone was a little more friendly. All the boys gone into town, huh? All but old Candy. He just sits in the bunkhouse, sharpening his pencil and sharpening and figuring. Crook adjusted his glasses. Figuring? What's Candy figuring about? Lenny almost shouted, About the rabbits! Oh, you're nuts, said Crooks. You're crazy as a wedge. What rabbits you talking about? The rabbits we're gonna get. And I get to tend 'em, cut grass, and give 'em water, and like that. Just nuts, said Crooks. I don't blame the guy you travel with for keeping you out of sight. Lenny said quietly, It ain't no lie. We're gonna do it. Gonna get a little place and live on the fat of the land. Crook settled himself more comfortably on his bunk. Sit down, he invited. Sit down on the nail keg. Lenny hunched down on the little barrel. You think it's a lie, Lenny said, but it ain't no lie. Every word's the truth, and you can ask George. Crooks put his dark chin into his pink palm. You travel around with George, don't you? Sure. Me and him goes every place together. Crooks continued. Sometimes he talks, and you don't know what the heck he's talking about. Ain't that so? He leaned forward, boring Lenny with his deep eyes. Ain't that so? Yeah, sometimes. Just talks on, and you don't know what the heck it's all about? Yeah, sometimes, but not always. Crooks leaned forward over the edge of his bunk. I ain't a Southern man, he said. I was born right here in California. My old man had a chicken ranch, about 10 acres. The kids come to play at our place, and sometimes I went to play with them. Some of them was pretty nice. My old man didn't like that. I never knew till long later why he didn't like that. But I know now. He hesitated, and when he spoke again his voice was softer. There wasn't another colored family for miles around. And now there ain't a colored man on this ranch, and there's just one family in Soledad. He laughed. If I say something, why, it's just an African-American saying it. Lenny asked, How long do you think it'll be before those pups will be old enough to pet? Crooks laughed again. A guy can talk to you and be sure you won't go blabbing. A couple of weeks and them pups will be all right. George knows what he's about. Just talks, and you don't understand nothing. He leaned forward excitedly. This is just me talking, so it don't mean nothing, see? You couldn't remember it anyways. I seen it over and over. A guy talking to another guy, and it don't make no difference if he don't hear or understand. The thing is they're talking or they're setting, still not talking. It don't make no difference. No difference! His excitement had increased until he pounded his knee with his hand. George can tell you screwy things, and it don't matter. It's just the talking. It's just being done with another guy. That's all. He paused. His voice grew soft and persuasive. S'pose George don't come back no more. S'pose he took a powder and just ain't coming back. What'll you do then? Lenny's attention came gradually to what had been said. What? He demanded. I said, s'pose George went in town tonight and you never heard of him no more. Crooks pressed forward some kind of private victory. Just s'pose that, he repeated. He won't do it, Lenny cried. George wouldn't do nothing like that. I've been with George a long time. He'll come back tonight. But the doubt was too much for him. Don't you think he will? Crook's face lighted with pleasure in his torture. Nobody can't tell you what a guy'll do, he observed calmly. Let's say he wants to come back and can't. Suppose he gets killed or hurt, or so he can't come back. Lenny struggled to understand. George won't do nothing like that, he repeated. George is careful. He won't get hurt. He ain't never been hurt, 'cause he's careful. Well, just suppose he don't come back. What'll you do then?" Lenny's face wrinkled with apprehension. "I don't know. Say, what you doing anyways?" he cried. "This ain't true. George ain't got hurt." Crooks bored in on him. "Want me to tell you what'll happen? They'll take you to the booby hatch. They'll tie you up with a collar like a dog." What is a booby hatch? Why does Crooks tell Lenny that he'll end up there? Why does the author use a simile to describe what happens at the booby hatch? Suddenly, Lenny's eyes centered and grew quiet and mad. He stood up and walked dangerously toward Crooks. "Who hurt George?" he demanded. Crooks saw the danger as it approached him. He edged back on his bunk to get out of the way. "I was just supposing," he said. "George ain't hurt. He's all right. He'll be back all right." Lenny stood over him. "What you s'posin' for? Ain't nobody gonna s'pose no hurt to George." Crooks removed his glasses and wiped his eyes with his fingers. "Just sit down," he said. "George ain't hurt." Lenny growled back to his seat on the nail keg. "Ain't nobody gonna talk no hurt to George," he grumbled. Crooks said gently, "Maybe you can see now. You got George. You know he's gonna come back. Suppose you didn't have nobody. Suppose you couldn't go into the bunkhouse and play rummy 'cause you was black. How'd you like that? Suppose you had to sit out here and read books. Sure, you could play horseshoes till it got dark, but then you gotta read books. Books ain't no good. A guy needs somebody to be near him." He whined. "A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. Don't make no difference who the guy is, long as he's with you, I tell you. A guy gets too lonely and he gets sick." "George gonna come back," Lenny reassured himself in a frightened voice. "Maybe George come back already. Maybe I better go see." Crooks said, "I didn't mean to scare you. He'll come back. I was talking about myself. A guy sits alone out here at night, maybe reading books or thinking or stuff like that. Sometimes he gets thinking, and he got nothing to tell him what's so and what ain't so. Maybe if he sees something, he don't know whether it's right or not. He can't turn to some other guy and ask him if he sees it too. He can't tell. He got nothing to measure by. I seen things out here. I wasn't drunk. I don't know if I was asleep. If some guy was with me, he could tell me I was asleep, and then it would be all right. But I just don't know." Crooks was looking across the room now, looking toward the window. Lenny said miserably, "George wouldn't go away and leave me. I know George wouldn't do that." The stable buck went on dreamily. "I remember when I was a little kid on my old man's chicken ranch. Had 2 brothers. They was always near me, always there. Used to sleep right in the same room, right in the same bed. All 3 had a strawberry patch. Had an alfalfa patch. Used to turn the chickens out into the alfalfa on a sunny morning. My brothers sat on the fence rail and watch 'em. White chickens they was." Gradually, Lenny's interest came around to what was being said. "George says we're going to have alfalfa for the rabbits." "What rabbits?" "We're going to have rabbits and a berry patch." "You're nuts." "We are too. You ask George." "You're nuts." Crooks was scornful. "I seen hundreds of men come on by the road by the ranches with their bindles on their back and that same darn thing in their head. Hundreds of 'em. They come and they quit and go on. Every darn one of 'em gets a little piece of land in their head. And never a goddamn one of 'em ever gets it. Just like heaven. Everybody wants a little piece of land. I read plenty of books out here. Nobody never gets to heaven, and nobody gets no land. It's just in their head. They're all the time talking about it, but it's just in their head." How does Crooks' explanation of men's dreams begin to develop the idea that George and Lenny's American dream may only be a dream? Crooks paused and looked toward the open door, for the horses were moving restlessly and the halter chains clanked. A horse whinnied. "I guess somebody's out there," Crooks said. "Maybe Slim. Slim comes in sometimes 2, 3 times a night. Slim's a real skinner. He looks out for his team." He pulled himself painfully upright and moved toward the door. "That you, Slim?" he called. Candy's voice answered. "Slim went into town.
"Say, you seen Lenny?"